If we have to borrow money, we borrow. It's not borrowing is not a leprosy. We just have to work hard to be able to pay for it.
Nigeria's government has approved over 114 trillion naira in public spending in less than 3 years. That is not a typo. 114 trillion naira, and budget implementation has not crossed 50%. Where did the money go? That is the question Peter Obi just put on the table in public with evidence and on the record. And today, I am going to answer it. While everyone is talking about the politics between Obi and Tinubu, the tribal framing, the 2027 positioning, the back and forth on social media, nobody is asking the one question that actually matters. If the president approved 3.3 trillion naira to settle power sector debts in 2024 and then approved the same 3.3 trillion naira again in 2026, described as a full and final settlement, what happened to the first payment? Where did Nigeria's billions go? I have spent time with the numbers, the documents, and the government's own records. Before we go any further, if you are new here, I need one moment with you. Every video I make costs me hours, not hours of talking, hours of digging, verifying, cross-checking so that when I say something, it is true. No agenda, no tribe, just the facts, treated with the respect you deserve. The only thing I ask in return is that you subscribe. One click, that is it. It tells YouTube this kind of work matters, and honestly, it's the only thing that tells me to keep going. Hit subscribe right now. Then, let us get into this.
Let me give you the precise trigger, because this story has a specific date and a specific document, and it matters. In early April 2026, President Bola Tinubu approved 3.3 trillion naira as what was described as a full and final settlement for accumulated debts in the power sector. Peter Obi responded within days, not with a press conference, not with a rally, but with a written statement on his X account. Calm, structured, documented. His point was simple. The same amount, 3.3 trillion naira, was approved on May 17, 2024. Same figure, same sector, same framing. And in the 2 years between that first approval and this one, power supply has not improved, it has worsened. In fact, discussions have emerged, public discussions, about disconnecting the presidential villa itself from the national grid, because the debts the villa owes to the power sector have not been paid. Let that sit with you for a moment. The government that is supposed to be rescuing the power sector owes the power sector money. Now, this alone would be a story, but it is not an isolated incident. Alongside that 2024 approval, a separate 4 trillion naira bond was also approved to settle similar electricity liabilities. So we're talking about multiple multi-trillion interventions stacked on top of each other, none of which have produced a measurable improvement in what every Nigerian experiences every single day: reliable electricity. Obi's question is precise, and it deserves a precise answer. These were announced as solutions. Why is Nigeria back at the same table, paying the same bill with nothing to show for it? Why is this story escalating right now? The 2027 election cycle is beginning to take shape. Obi is methodically building a public accountability record, not through protest, not through emotion, but through documented, data-heavy challenges that are designed not just for public consumption, but for the electoral court of opinion. The timing is deliberate, and it is working. For historical context, and I will be brief because this is not a history lecture, power sector debt in Nigeria is not new. APC administrations from 2015 to 2025 accumulated much of this liability across successive governments. The sector has been structurally broken for decades. What is new, and this is the key point, is the pattern of trillion naira approvals that produce no visible improvement, combined with a government that has stopped publishing the very evidence that would tell you what happened to the money. That is what has changed, and that is what we are going to unpack. Now, I want to go somewhere that most commentary on this story does not go. I want to go into the institutions, the specific bodies involved, the specific laws being broken, and the specific pattern of failure that makes this more than just political noise. Which institutions are we talking about? The Federal Ministry of Finance, the Budget Office of the Federation, the Debt Management Office, the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, the Rural Electrification Agency, and the Presidency itself. Every one of these bodies has a role in approving, tracking, or accounting for the money in question. Now, let me tell you what the law actually says, because this is where it gets serious. Section 85 of the 1999 Constitution as amended requires that all public funds be paid into the Consolidated Revenue Fund and that no money be withdrawn without appropriation by the National Assembly. That is the constitutional baseline. The Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2007 goes further. It mandates that the federal government publish quarterly budget implementation reports, not annually, not when convenient, quarterly, every 3 months. It's a legal requirement. These are not suggestions, they are not guidelines, they are law. Now here's where the law is being ignored. According to Peter Obi's documented public statement, and this has not been disputed by the government, in 2025, not a single budget implementation report was released. 0. Not one quarterly report, not one annual summary. The OpenTreasury.gov.ng portal, a transparency framework inherited from the Buhari administration, one of the few functional accountability tools Nigeria had developed, has reportedly gone dark. I want you to understand what that means. This is not a bureaucratic delay. This is not a capacity problem. This is a structural decision to remove the tools that allow citizens, journalists, and civil society to track where public money goes. That is not a technicality. That is a dismantling of accountability. There's also what Obi calls the overlapping budgets problem, and Tinubu himself acknowledged it when he addressed the National Assembly about the 2026 budget. Since 2023, Nigeria has simultaneously been implementing items from the 2023, 2024, and 2025 budgets, 3 active budgets at the same time. No serious country manages its finances this way. Tinubu pledged to end the practice from April 2026, operating on a single budget backed by a single revenue cycle. That pledge itself is an admission of the problem. But acknowledge this, the damage to public finance credibility is already done. 114 trillion naira approved, less than 50% implemented, no public report explaining the gap. That is not a transition challenge, that is a credibility crisis. Has this happened before? Power sector intervention is not new. Nigeria has been throwing money at the power problem since the 2013 privatization exercise. What has changed is the scale of opacity. Under previous administrations, with all their failures, quarterly and annual implementation reports were published. Nigerians could see the numbers. Under this administration, they have stopped. That is the departure. That is what is new.
Now, I want to shift from what happened to why it is happening, and specifically, who is driving this story and what they want from it. Here is what most people are missing. Peter Obi is not just complaining. He's not venting. He's not doing what politicians in Nigeria typically do, which is make noise and move on. He is building a case, a structured, evidenced, methodically documented public case with every statement time-stamped, every figure sourced, and every claim attributable to government's own records. Every press statement is a documented exhibit. He's positioning himself as the only major opposition figure with the intellectual credibility and the discipline to hold this government to account with facts rather than emotion. That is a political strategy, and it is working, because it is almost impossible to argue with him without first engaging with the numbers, and the numbers are the government's own. Who benefits directly from the lack of transparency? Think about it clearly. Without published implementation reports, the public cannot independently verify where trillions went. Without an active open treasury portal, civil society and the media cannot track expenditure in real time. Every day that accountability is delayed is a day the government operates without scrutiny. Opacity is not an accident. Opacity is protection. Who loses? If Obi's challenge goes unanswered, and so far there has been no substantive government response to his April 2026 statement, this becomes Tinubu's single most vulnerable 2027 liability. Governors in the Southeast and the South-South who aligned with the APC and staked their political futures on it now face a problem. Their constituents are angry about electricity, and the accountability frame for that anger has been set by Obi. The Labour Party is the direct beneficiary of sustained, documented public frustration. The electoral implications for 2027 are significant, and here is why Obi chose this issue specifically. Power supply is a kitchen table issue. It's not abstract, it's not technical. Every Nigerian household feels it. The generator costs, the food spoiled in a failed fridge, the business that cannot operate after dark, the student who cannot study. It's personal, it's daily, and it crosses every ethnic, religious, and regional line in Nigeria. Obi's choice to anchor his accountability campaign here, not on petrol prices, not on exchange rates, not on food inflation, even though those are legitimate issues, is strategically precise, because it is almost impossible to be a Tinubu loyalist and defend a government that paid 3.3 trillion naira twice for electricity that never came. On regional dynamics, the Southeast, where Obi's core support base is concentrated, has historically suffered some of the most unreliable power supply in the country. The symbolic weight of an Igbo man demanding answers on electricity cannot be separated from that lived reality. But watch how he frames it. He's not speaking to the Southeast, he's speaking to Nigeria. His language is national. His data covers all 6 geopolitical zones because he knows, and his team knows, that a 2027 coalition requires the Middle Belt, the Northwest, and parts of the Southwest. He cannot win on regional anger alone. He needs a national accountability argument. This is that argument. Now, let me point you to the silent stakeholders, the actors who have not spoken publicly but who are very much present in this story. The National Assembly. Under the Constitution, appropriations are the legislature's responsibility. Every naira of that 114 trillion naira was passed by the Senate and the House of Representatives. If less than 50% was implemented and if no report was produced, the legislature bears co-responsibility for the transparency failure. They approved the money. They have the constitutional power to demand accountability for it. They have not done so. Watch whether any Senate Public Accounts Committee or House Finance Committee calls a hearing, because if the legislature stays silent on this, that silence is itself a political story. There's one more angle I need to flag before I take you to the mid-video, and I'm going to come back to it in full at the end because it deserves its own moment. In January 2026, Tinubu wrote off 8 trillion naira NNCP debts. 8 trillion, a figure that is nearly double Nigeria's entire national security budget for 2025. Obi called it a betrayal. He said citizens deserve honesty, fiscal discipline, and governance that protects public interest, not the interest of mismanaged corporations or political elites. That story has not received the scrutiny it deserves. I'm going to give it that scrutiny in a few minutes. Hold that thought. And before we go there, I need to make sure you haven't missed this. The presidential villa itself reportedly owes significant outstanding electricity debts to the distribution companies, debts that accumulate despite annual budget provisions specifically meant to cover those obligations. The government's own residence, the seat of executive power, was not paying its electricity bills while approving trillions to rescue the sector it owed money to. That is not a crisis of the power companies, that's a crisis of governance credibility. Stop right there. Before I show you what comes next, I need you to do something. Go to the comment section right now and tell me what you are thinking, because most people watching this are feeling one of two things. Either they are shocked or they are starting to connect dots they never expected to connect. Tell me which one you are. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. What I have shown you so far is the setup. The part coming next is why this story matters. You don't want to be mid-thought when it hits and not have this channel saved. And if this is making you think, tap like. It costs you nothing and it puts this in front of someone who needs to see it. Alright, here is where it gets real. I want to zoom out now because this story is not just about Peter Obi and Bola Tinubu. This is about what kind of country Nigeria is becoming and what the consequences are for every person watching this video. On the federal-state power balance, when the federal government approves multi-trillion interventions without accountability, state governments inherit the political fallout, the erratic power, the public anger, the economic stagnation, but they do not control the money. The federal center retains that. So governors across the country, regardless of party, are trapped. They bear the political cost of a problem they cannot solve because they do not control the funds meant to fix it. That asymmetry weakens governors' leverage and consolidates federal presidential fiscal power. That is a structural shift in Nigeria's political architecture, and it is happening quietly behind the noise of day-to-day politics. The economic consequences are measurable and they are serious. Nigeria's 2025 budget allocated 15.81 trillion naira to debt servicing alone. Not infrastructure, not education, not health, debt service. That is the single largest line item. Then Tinubu disclosed at the Africa Forward Summit in Nairobi, in public on the record, that Nigeria is projected to spend $11.6 billion on debt servicing in 2026, with nearly half of expected national revenue going to repayment obligations. In 2025, Nigeria paid $848.7 million in debt service to just two World Bank institutions, the International Development Association and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And despite those payments, Nigeria's outstanding debt to those same institutions rose to $19.8 billion by the end of the year. Nigeria is paying more and owing more at the same time. That is a debt spiral. And it is happening against a backdrop of fiscal opacity, a government that cannot produce budget implementation reports and cannot account for where 2.33 trillion naira in power sector payments went. Investor confidence in a government that cannot produce basic accountability documents is at minimum impaired. At maximum, it is a sovereign risk signal. On democratic health, the Fiscal Responsibility Act exists for a reason. When a government stops publishing quarterly implementation reports and when the legislature does not demand them, Nigeria's democratic accountability infrastructure degrades in practice, even if it remains intact on paper. The laws are still there, the institutions still exist, but if the instruments of accountability are not used, they atrophy. That is the pattern Obi is naming, and it deserves to be taken seriously by every Nigerian, regardless of political affiliation. Let me make this concrete for you. The market trader in Onitsha that runs a generator for 12 hours a day because any DC supply is unreliable is not an inconvenience. That is a business tax borne entirely by the private citizen for a public failure. The student in Kano studying by candlelight for WAEC, that is not a character-building challenge. That is a structural inequality. The hospital in Plateau State losing vaccines in a failed cold chain because the backup generator ran out of diesel, that is not bad luck. That is the human cost of a power sector that has received trillions and delivered nothing measurable. These are not abstractions. These are the real consequences of what we are analyzing, and they fall hardest on the people who can least afford them. Now, how does the world see this? Because Nigeria's fiscal accountability problem is not just a domestic political debate, it's a sovereign credibility question that has real consequences for what Nigeria can borrow, what it costs to borrow, and how international partners engage with this government. Nigeria's total debt exposure to the World Bank's International Development Association and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development reached approximately $19.8 billion by the end of 2025. That's after paying $848.7 million in debt service that same year. The debt grew despite the repayments. And then Tinubu said at the Africa Forward Summit in Nairobi, in public, on the record, that Nigeria is projected to spend $11.6 billion in debt servicing in 2026, with nearly half of expected national revenue going to repayment obligations. He framed this as a structural problem with global financial system. And there is something to that argument, but you cannot make a credible case for restructuring global debt architecture when your domestic fiscal architecture lacks basic transparency. The international community does not separate those two things. Creditors do not. For Nigerians in the diaspora, in the UK, the US, Canada, Europe, this is not distant news. A government that cannot account for 114 trillion naira in appropriations is a government whose macroeconomic instability directly erodes the value of every naira you send home. Exchange rate management and fiscal transparency are connected. When investor confidence weakens and foreign exchange reserves come under pressure, remittance value suffers. This is not an abstract policy debate. It lands in real naira at the point of transfer. And finally, for those who follow democratic governance globally, what Nigeria is experiencing fits a documented pattern: executive fiscal opacity, weakened transparency institutions, a legislature that does not exercise its oversight function. These are markers of what political scientists call democratic backsliding, a gradual erosion of accountability infrastructure that does not require a coup or a constitutional crisis. It happens quietly through inaction, through institutional neglect, and through the slow closing of information channels. Nigeria is not alone in experiencing this, but recognizing the pattern is the first step to resisting it. Now, and this is important, I am not going to give you only one side of this story. That is not what this channel is. If I wanted to simply validate what you already believe, I would not be doing analysis. I would be doing entertainment. So let me give you the strongest case that Tinubu's defenders will make, and I mean the strongest version, not a straw man, not a caricature, the real argument. And then I will show you where it breaks down. The government's position is this: the Tinubu administration inherited a structurally broken power sector, not from 2023, but from decades of mismanagement, with debts accumulated across multiple governments, going back to before privatization in 2013. The 3.3 trillion naira approval is a necessary structural intervention in a sector that requires sustained, long-term reform. These things take time. Infrastructure does not change overnight. And look at the broader economic picture. Nigeria's economy grew at 3.98% in the third quarter of 2025 compared to 3.86% in the same period the year before. Inflation fell for 8 consecutive months, declining to 14.45% in November 2025 from a peak of 24.23% in March of that year. External reserves reached a 7-year high of approximately $47 billion. These are real numbers. The government did not invent them. And the strongest argument in the government's favor, the one I think deserves the most honest engagement, is this: no government inherits a clean ledger. The APC accumulated power sector debts from 2015 to 2025 under its own administrations. Tinubu did not create this problem. He inherited it. Structural reform in a sector this broken takes years, not months. The fact that it takes time is not evidence of dishonesty. It is the reality of infrastructure change at scale in a complex economy. I want to acknowledge that argument fully because it is not wrong on its face. Here here is where it breaks down. Inherited problems do not excuse opacity. The Fiscal Responsibility Act mandates quarterly reporting regardless of who caused the underlying debt. That is a legal obligation on the current administration, not the previous one. Stopping the Open Treasury portal is not a fiscal decision, it is an information decision. Someone decided that Nigerians should have less access to data about how their money is spent. That decision was made under this administration. It cannot be inherited. And approving 3.3 trillion naira in 2024 as a settlement for power sector debts, then approving the same 3.3 trillion naira in 2026, again as a full and final settlement without any public explanation of what happened to the first payment, is not inherited dysfunction. That is a new failure created entirely under this administration. That is not Buhari's problem. That is Tinubu's problem. I also need to address a misconception that is circulating widely on social media, and I want to be direct about it. Some people are framing Peter Obi's accountability demands as tribal, arguing that his challenge is motivated by the fact that he is Igbo and Tinubu is Yoruba. I want to reject that framing clearly, and here is why. Obi has applied identical scrutiny with the same data-driven, documented approach to NNPC under administrations of different ethnic backgrounds. The data he cites is drawn from government's own documents, budgets, DMO reports, the budget office, the central bank. He is not manufacturing numbers. Disagree with his conclusions if you have counter-evidence, but do not substitute ethnicity for analysis. That is not engagement with the argument, that is avoidance of it. And let me end this section with the national implication that cuts through it all. For the ordinary Nigerian, the farmer, the market trader, the nurse, the teacher, the student, what matters is not who is politically right. What matters is whether 3.3 trillion naira improved their electricity supply. It did not. That is the factual baseline, and from that baseline, every other argument must begin.
Now, let me resolve something I raised earlier and told you to hold. In January 2026, the Tinubu government wrote off 8 trillion naira in NNPC debts. 8 trillion naira, wiped from the books. No public audit of how those debts were accumulated, no independent verification of the right of methodology, just a decision announced, executed. I want you to sit with that number in context. 8 trillion naira is nearly double Nigeria's entire national security budget for 2025, the budget that is supposed to fund the fight against Boko Haram, banditry, kidnapping, and all the security crises that Nigerians live with every day. Nearly double that budget, cancelled quietly for a corporation. Now ask yourself this. If the government can cancel 8 trillion naira in NNPC debts without a public audit, while simultaneously asking Nigerians to trust multi-trillion naira power sector interventions, what is the accountability standard being applied? The answer is there is none that is publicly enforceable. And that is the structural problem Obi is pointing at. It is not about one payment. It is about a system that has disabled the tools that will allow any payment to be scrutinized. So what happens next? Let me give you the most likely moves from each key actor. The government. Tinubu's team will likely issue a technical defense of the 3.3 trillion naira through the Ministry of Power or the Federal Ministry of Works and Housing, citing legacy debt structures, distribution company obligations, and the complexity of the sector. That is the predictable play. But watch closely for one specific thing. Does that response include an audit trail for the 2024 payment? Does it show with documentation where the first 3.3 trillion naira went? If it does not, and I am telling you now, if it does not, the story does not go away, it grows. Peter Obi,
His pattern is consistent and it is disciplined. He starts with documented public statements. He establishes the record. Then he escalates to formal legislative engagement either through Labour Party members in the National Assembly or through civil society organizations. I expect a Freedom of Information request to the Ministry of Finance on budget implementation reports within the next 90 days. That's how he operates. Watch for it. The National Assembly. This is the swing variable, the actor whose move we cannot predict and whose silence or engagement will define how this story develops. If the Senate Public Accounts Committee or the House Finance Committee calls a formal hearing on budget implementation reports and power sector expenditure, that changes everything. It becomes a parliamentary investigation. It forces document production. It puts officials under oath. If the legislature stays silent, that silence is also a story. It tells you something important about whose interests the National Assembly is serving. What specific signals should you watch for in the coming days and weeks? 4 things. First, any official government response to Obi's April 2026 statement and whether that response contains an audit trail or just a political rebuttal. Second, whether opentreasury.gov.ng is updated, the return of that portal would be a meaningful concession to transparency. Third, the next Central Bank Monetary Policy Committee meeting, because fiscal opacity complicates monetary policy credibility and the CBN cannot maintain inflation targets in an environment of unaccountable public spending. Fourth, any movement in the National Assembly towards an independent power sector audit. That is the one that would have real teeth. The 6-month and 12-month political impact of this story is significant. By October 2026, if no credible public account of the power sector trillions has been produced, this becomes a formative issue in the 2027 campaign, possibly the most powerful accountability frame any opposition candidate has deployed in a Nigerian presidential election. Because it is not ideological, it is not tribal, it is fiscal, it is specific, and it is documented. The 2027 race is not just about personalities, it's increasingly about fiscal credibility. And on that front, the current administration has a serious vulnerability. Let me put my prediction on the table, and I am accountable for it. The Tinubu government will issue a technical response on the power sector payments within 30 days, but that response will not include a full audit trail for the 2024 3.3 trillion naira, because that trail does not exist in any publicly accessible document. I am putting that on record today. Come back and tell me if I was right. At the top of this video, I asked you a question. If the president approved 3.3 trillion naira to settle power sector debts in 2024 and approved the same amount again in 2026, what happened to the first payment? Here is the honest answer based on everything we have covered today. We do not know, and that's the problem. Not because the money was necessarily stolen, though that remains a legitimate question for auditors with access to documents the public does not have, but because a government that approved 114 trillion naira in 3 years, that stopped publishing the budget implementation reports the law requires, that took down its own transparency portal, and that cannot explain why the same bill is being paid twice, that government has forfeited the public's right to simply trust the answer. Trust has to be earned through evidence, and when the evidence is withheld, what is left? What the facts support is this. Nigeria has a structural transparency failure that operates independently of which party holds power. The tools of accountability, the quarterly reports, the treasury portal, the budget implementation data, these existed before this administration. They have been diminished under it. That's what's new. Not the underlying problems, the dismantling of the instruments we use to track the problems. That's the story. That's what Peter Obi is asking about. And frankly, every Nigerian should be asking the same question, not because of tribe, not because of 2027, but because it's your money, 114 trillion naira of it. My question for you, and I want you to answer it below because I read these comments and they shape what I cover next. If the government released a full audit trail tomorrow showing exactly where every naira of the 2024 3.3 trillion naira went, would that be enough for you? Or do you think the accountability problem in Nigeria runs deeper than any single audit can fix? Tell me below. I genuinely want to know where you stand. That's everything I have for you today. I made a decision when I started this channel. I decided I would rather have a smaller audience that trusts me completely than a large one built on telling people what they want to hear. That decision has a cost, and every video I post, I feel it. When you like, share, and subscribe, you are not just doing me a favor, you are also keeping a particular kind of voice in this space alive. The kind that checks its facts, the kind that admits when the picture is complicated. Nigeria doesn't have enough of those voices. I am trying to be one of them. Help me stay here. Comment below, tell me where this lands for you. I'll see you in the next one. Stay unfiltered.